The Economist.
Siegmund Warburg was a banker who played a pioneering role in reshaping the City of London after the Second World War, and he's the subject of a recent biography by historian Niall Ferguson. Ferguson's a man of many parts, a transatlantic academic and TV presenter. He's also been involved in a continuing debate with Paul Krugman about the value and risks of the US economic stimulus. We wanted to learn more about that discussion and more about Siegmund Warburg, so we had Niall in for tea. Niall Ferguson, thank you for coming to tea with The Economist. Now, you've written very widely about financial and economic history. What made you alight on the subject of Siegmund Warburg?
Well, in many ways, he's the most interesting figure in the post-war City of London. He's a refugee from Nazi Germany who starts from scratch in the mid-30s. After the firm he founds becomes S.G. Warburg, it very quickly becomes the most dynamic merchant bank in the City of London. And I think one can legitimately claim that without Siegmund Warburg, London would not necessarily have made it back into the first rank of financial centres, because it was pretty messed up in 1945. I mean, literally, it had been bombed by the Luftwaffe. But crucially, London for 200 years had been a financial centre that exported capital. By 1945, unfortunately, Britain was a huge debtor nation because of the costs of the war. So it needed somebody with the spark of genius to figure out how to get the place back on its feet.
And two things stand out from that career: the hostile takeover of British aluminium and the introduction of the Eurobond market.
Yes, and that sounds a little odd to celebrate the hostile takeover as a financial innovation, but I think it is, in fact, an important development in British and indeed in Western financial history. Along comes Siegmund Warburg. He finds that there's interest in an American company in trying to put money into British aluminium. And he and his colleagues at S.G. Warburg covertly begin to build up a big stake for Reynolds, which was the American company, using a front company, really a British company, to keep it from being a foreign takeover. And they gradually build up a larger and larger stake in British aluminium until they're in a position, in fact, to take control. And the enormous flap this causes in the city really has to be read about to be believed. I mean, there are calls to the Prime Minister. Poor Hal Macmillan is tearing out his hair in frustration. He can't go shooting without members of the board of British Aluminium bending his ear about this awful man, Warburg. And I think that's actually a fascinating story, because it tells you just how stuffy the culture of the city was in the 50s. It really wasn't a question of banks. These things had become gentlemen's clubs with a small finance division. And I think it was Warburg who really began to shake the place up. From then on, corporate raids became the order of the day. Mergers and acquisitions were no longer forbidden. They were no longer done just on the basis of gentlemanly agreements. And I think it meant that, fundamentally, the capital structure of the British economy got shaken up.
Yes, you could see it as the start of the Anglo-Saxon financial model, couldn't you? It took Europe 40 years to catch up. And on the Eurobond market, that was very important for sort of international capital flows, setting up London as an important centre again.
It's actually a political as much as an economic idea to create an integrated offshore capital market where bonds can be bought and sold by investors, the proverbial Belgian dentist with his drawer full of post-war dollars. And all of this could operate beyond the control of national governments. Now, at the time, British governments were being advised by pretty left-of-centre economists that the last thing they wanted was the return of international finance, because this would only result in sterling crises. So, in fact, to make the Eurobond market happen, Warburg and his colleagues had to create something that was outside the control of national governments. And that was really quite ingenious. And I think this is the beginning of financial globalization as we know it. It's the first truly international financial market where capital can flow completely freely since the Depression.
You're quite well known, probably to Economist readers from the conference circuit, in drawing historical parallels and looking back at the period before the First World War, when globalization was failing, and also for recently warning about the excesses of government deficits and having a little spat with Paul Krugman about it. Yeah. As we move into year 3, I suppose, of the financial crisis, where do you see those parallels now? How do you assess the situation?
This argument sometimes gets caricatured as stimulus versus austerity. I think that's a complete misrepresentation. I've never said that in 2010 the US should be running a balanced budget. That was never a possibility, and there was a case for fiscal stimulus, particularly after the 2008 meltdown. It's the recurrence of deficits every year for the rest of time which I have a problem with, because I think at some point the credibility of your fiscal policy is bound to be called into question by financial markets. Even if interest rates stay low nominally, the fact of the matter is that the debt keeps growing. And guess what? So do the interest payments. One minute you're spending maybe 7% of federal revenues on interest payments. In a few years' time that could be 20%, maybe even more, depending on how things go with the economy. And this is where history is helpful. I think more helpful than economic theory, because history says that once countries get into that position, especially great powers, once you've got maybe a fifth, maybe even a quarter of all revenues just going on interest payments, well, that really limits your room for manoeuvre in a whole lot of ways, including in national security. But more than anything else, it raises questions about your future creditworthiness. I don't know that many countries have the option anymore to do more stimulus. I don't think Britain had that option, for example. I don't think really there was much choice. There had to be some kind of fiscal tightening here because the credibility was about to run out. The US still has a little breathing space, but the word little is the operative word in that sentence. It's probably at most a couple of years before I think the questions start getting asked that have already been asked about Greece and Portugal and Spain. So that's the essence of the debate. It's not that I'm sort of wanting to put on the Herbert Hoover hair shirt. That I think is not what we need right now. I just would like to see a plan to get back into equilibrium in a 5 to 10 year time frame. And I think we could quite easily come up with such a plan. It does exist, for example, in Paul Ryan's roadmap. But nobody in Washington wants to talk about this. And so it's my impression that we're kind of sleepwalking towards the cliff edge with Paul Krugman as the Pied Piper.
The cattle prod behind.
Yeah, the cattle prod.
The reason that we can fund these deficits, of course, is because Asian countries have run up surpluses and China is a big investor in treasury bonds. Now, you've talked about Chimerica as this sort of dual country with America buying the goods and China financing them. And you've also cast China as a sort of Wilhelmine Germany before the First World War, as this sort of rising power that needs to be satisfied. Do you think we're any close to resolving that issue? Can China and America come to a long-term understanding?
Well, Chimerica is alive and well in the sense that if you just look at growth in the year from first quarter 2009 to first quarter 2010, 48% of global growth was China plus the United States, with China, incidentally, accounting for the larger share. So Chimerica is certainly still the engine of the global economy, as it was when Moritz Schleierich and I coined the term back in late 2006. The question is really whether this is a stable marriage or one that is heading for the rocks. And it's quite interesting when you listen to the Chinese. I've just spent 2 weeks in China. How nervous they are. They don't know whether to be afraid of a dollar devaluation, of some kind of default. I mean, half the federal debt's in foreign hands. We know historically that under those circumstances it's quite tempting somehow or other to cheat the foreign lenders. And this makes them very uneasy. So I think Chimerica is an unhappy marriage, whereas prior to 2007 it was still quite a happy one. And then there are a whole series of strategic issues. If it's true, and I think it probably is, that at some point within the next 20 years, China will be a bigger economy than the United States, that has major geopolitical implications. And many people in Washington, D.C. really don't want to think about that. They would rather say, and I've heard this 1,000 times, they need us as much as we need them. I don't think that's true. I don't think they do, in fact, need the United States as much as the US needs China, because Chinese exporters have found that they don't really need to rely and can't really expect to rely on the US consumer for the indefinite future, especially with the US consumer weighed down with debt. More and more trade is going on within Asia right now. China's stimulus was really an Asian stimulus, with China's neighbours benefiting disproportionately. So the big shifts going on, if you like, in the realm of geoeconomics, and inevitably that will have strategic implications. Now, the parallel with Wilhelmine Germany was a sort of throwaway historical analogy just to help us think about this. 100 years ago, I think Britain was roughly where the United States is now, and China is roughly where Germany was then. Catching up, gaining in confidence, perhaps becoming a little arrogant. And there's a shrillness to Chinese nationalism, a sort of, after 500 years of underachievement, we're back, and this time no more Mr. Nice Guy. That, when you come across it, it's not the official line, of course, which is still relatively emollient, but when you come across it among younger Chinese, that for me is a sign that over the next 10, 20 years, as these young people come into positions of power, China is going to become rather more dragon-like.
And of course, in 1912, I think Norman Angell, a historian, wrote a book saying that despite this rise of Germany, war between the powers was just not in anybody's interest because of the economic ties that existed. The Great Illusion, it was called. Do you think it's possible that these tensions could erupt in war, that we're too complacent about the ability to keep everything peaceful?
Well, certainly it's a terrible warning to us all. Just to assume that economic interdependence equals peace is, generally speaking, to be proved wrong. In Angell's case, it was within about 2 years. It's also a warning not to believe anything you read written by an employee of Associated Newspapers, because in fact Norman Angell wasn't a historian, he was a journalist with the Daily Mail. But the critical point here is that the interdependence between the United States and China, though it's very real, it's as big as the interdependence of Britain and Germany in 1914, doesn't rule out a showdown over some of the hot-button issues that are still unresolved in Asia. Taiwan was unresolved. North Korea is unresolved. Japan, its military status remains actually unresolved. The new Japanese government can't really make up its mind whether it wants to continue to be a military dependency of the United States. So there's some big issues out there. And in some ways they're more obvious big issues than Belgian neutrality was in 1914, or the status of Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1914, the issues that caused the First World War. So I suppose one of the lessons of history is don't lose sight of the low probability, high impact events. Geopolitics can catch you out if you believe that money makes the world go round and economics is the dominant force. Not always. In fact, if anything could really bring our age of globalization to a shuddering halt, it's not so much a financial crisis. We've sort of stress tested the world economy in the last couple of years. It's a geopolitical crisis.
Niall Ferguson, thank you very much for coming to see us.
Well, thanks for the tea.
So the lesson from Professor Ferguson is that if you're interested in finance or economics, you have to keep a weather eye on geopolitics as well. After all, it was geopolitics that caused Siegmund Warburg to set up in London rather than Frankfurt.